China manufactures roughly 80% of the world's solar panels. The United States leads the world in sanctions. One country ships hardware, the other ships restrictions. That's an oversimplification, of course. But like many oversimplifications, it survives because there's something inside it that's true. Over the last 20 years, Washington has built an extraordinary ability to shape global behavior through financial pressure. Access to the dollar system, export controls, entity lists, secondary sanctions, restrictions on technology transfers. The toolkit is vast. At the same time, China spent those same decades building factories, lots of them, not just solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, steel, rare earth processing, consumer electronics, industrial machinery, chemical feedstocks, components that most people never think about until they're missing. And that raises a question that sits underneath almost every major geopolitical story today. What matters more, the ability to stop someone from building something or the ability to build the thing everyone needs? Because that question is quietly reshaping trade, diplomacy, technology, and eventually your cost of living. Consider one figure. According to the International Energy Agency, China dominates multiple stages of the solar supply chain simultaneously, not just panel assembly, polysilicon refining, wafer production, cell manufacturing, module assembly, different layers, same country. That's not an accident. It is the result of industrial policy stretching back decades, involving local governments, state-backed financing, cheap land, infrastructure expansion, export support, and a willingness to tolerate years of low margins while competitors disappeared. Many Western policymakers assumed market forces would eventually rebalance the system. Instead, the system became more concentrated. The uncomfortable detail isn't that China became good at making solar panels. It's that China became good at making them cheaply, at scale, and continuously. Those are different things. Anyone can build a factory. Building 10,000 suppliers around that factory is harder. Building ports, rail links, financing networks, engineering talent pools, and specialized machine tool ecosystems around those suppliers is harder still. Industrial dominance often looks sudden from the outside. From the inside, it usually looks like 20 years of boring decisions. Meanwhile, Washington was pursuing a different form of power. After the Cold War, American influence rested on more than military strength. The dollar became the operating system of global finance. American technology firms occupied critical positions in digital infrastructure. U.S. capital markets became the deepest pools of investment on Earth. That created leverage, lots of leverage. When the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a company, banks paid attention. When the Commerce Department added firms to export control lists, supply chains adjusted. When Washington restricted advanced semiconductor exports, entire industries reevaluated investment plans. This wasn't symbolic, it worked. And that's the important point many discussions miss. Sanctions are often mocked today because people focus on cases where they failed to achieve maximal objectives. But many sanctions have been extremely effective at imposing costs. The real debate isn't whether sanctions work. The real debate is whether they still work as well as they used to. Those are different questions. Because every tool changes once people learn how to defend against it. Military armor evolves, so do financial systems. Trade networks adapt, governments improvise, companies reroute, and countries that expect restrictions to continue indefinitely start redesigning their economies around that assumption. We'll come back to that idea later because it's one of the most important developments in global economics, and one of the least appreciated. For the moment, focus on the contrast. One side accumulated manufacturing capacity, the other accumulated leverage. Both strategies generated power, both strategies produced results, yet power behaves differently depending on its source. A factory producing solar panels creates more panels tomorrow. A sanction creates pressure tomorrow. Those are not the same kind of asset. One expands through production, the other expands through compliance. That distinction sounds academic until you notice what's happening across energy, batteries, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, and increasingly even high technology. The countries gaining influence are often the ones making critical things, not merely regulating access to them. And if that's true, then the biggest geopolitical shift of the next decade may not be military. It may not even be financial. It may be a much older question. Who actually makes the world's necessities? And why did so many advanced economies stop trying? The common explanation for China's manufacturing rise is simple. Labor was cheap. That explanation was useful in 2005. It's inadequate in 2026. Cheap labor doesn't explain why China dominates solar panels, batteries, drones, electric buses, high-voltage transmission equipment, shipbuilding, and increasingly sophisticated industrial systems simultaneously. Cheap labor certainly doesn't explain why some Chinese factories now operate with levels of automation that rival or exceed facilities in Europe and North America. The labor story became a habit long after it stopped being sufficient. A better explanation begins with something economists call industrial ecosystems. Take a solar panel. Most people imagine a finished product arriving at a port. What they don't see is the chain behind it. The quartz that becomes polysilicon, the polysilicon that becomes wafers, the wafers that become cells, the cells that become modules, the glass manufacturers, the silver paste suppliers, the machinery companies, the logistics firms, the engineering contractors, the financing, the specialized workforce that already knows how to solve problems before they become expensive. When enough of those pieces exist in the same place, the system starts generating advantages that are difficult to copy. Not impossible, just difficult. And expensive. The United States learned this lesson in reverse. Between roughly 2000 and 2020, many policymakers viewed manufacturing as something that could be outsourced while retaining higher value activities at home. Design in America, produce elsewhere, sell everywhere. For years, that model appeared remarkably successful. Consumers got cheaper products. Corporate profits increased. Inflation remained relatively contained. Wall Street was happy. Voters enjoyed lower prices, even if they rarely connected those prices to global supply chains. The arrangement looked efficient. Then reality conducted a stress test. COVID arrived. Factories closed. Ports backed up. Shipping rates exploded. Basic goods suddenly became difficult to source. Products that had always seemed abundant became scarce. For the first time in decades, many governments realized they didn't merely depend on global supply chains, they depended on specific supply chains. And many of those supply chains led to China. That discovery altered policy discussions almost overnight. Officials in Washington started talking about resilience, strategic industries, friendshoring, nearshoring, industrial policy. Words that had sounded old-fashioned suddenly returned to fashion. What's fascinating is how quickly the conversation changed. For years, governments debated whether industrial policy was necessary. After the pandemic, the debate shifted toward whether they were already too late. That's a different conversation entirely. Then came semiconductors. At this point, it's tempting to tell a neat story. China builds, America restricts. Manufacturing beats sanctions. Case closed. The problem is that reality refuses to stay that tidy. Because if manufacturing alone determined global power, China would already be unquestionably dominant. It isn't. And that's the reversal. The country producing most of the world's solar panels still depends on foreign markets. The country issuing many of the world's sanctions still controls the financial system most global trade relies upon. Both possess strengths the other would like to have. Both possess vulnerabilities the other is trying to exploit. That changes the entire conversation. Take solar panels. China's position is extraordinary. Yet solar panels themselves are not where the largest profits often accumulate. This is a pattern repeated throughout economic history. The company that assembles a product doesn't always earn the highest margin. The company designing the software might. The company owning the patents might. The company controlling the operating system might. The company providing financing might. Value and production frequently occupy different addresses. Look at smartphones. A phone assembled in Asia can generate substantial profits for a company headquartered thousands of miles away. Manufacturing matters. Intellectual property matters too. Brand power matters. Financial power matters. Control over standards matters. The modern economy rewards multiple forms of leverage simultaneously. That's why reports of American decline often arrive several decades before the decline itself. The United States still hosts many of the world's most influential technology firms. Its capital markets remain the preferred destination for global investment. The dollar continues to dominate international reserves and trade settlement. Its research universities attract talent from virtually every continent. Its venture capital ecosystem remains difficult to replicate. Those advantages are real. They shouldn't be dismissed. But neither should China's industrial position, because something unusual has happened over the past decade. The gap between invention and production has narrowed. Historically, countries could innovate while manufacturing elsewhere. Increasingly, advanced manufacturing itself has become a source of innovation. Engineers learn things during production. Factories generate feedback. Supply chains generate expertise. Problems solved on factory floors often become tomorrow's technological advantages. That feedback loop is rarely visible from outside. Yet it matters. A lot. Consider batteries. China didn't become dominant simply because it built battery plants. It built suppliers around those plants, mining relationships, chemical processing capacity, refining infrastructure, research programs, large domestic markets willing to absorb production. Each layer reinforced the next. The ecosystem became the advantage, not the individual factory. And here's where ordinary people should pay attention, because geopolitical discussions often sound abstract until they reach your wallet. Industrial capacity influences energy prices, vehicle prices, consumer electronics, construction costs, grid modernization, employment opportunities, inflation itself. The location of production shapes daily life more than most political speeches ever will. A country capable of manufacturing key goods at scale possesses options during crises. A country that lacks those capabilities becomes dependent on decisions made elsewhere. The pandemic exposed that reality. Energy markets reinforced it. Supply chain disruptions highlighted it again. Which brings us back to sanctions. The most effective sanctions in history worked because alternatives were limited. If a country had nowhere else to turn, pressure was easier to apply. But every sanction contains an unintended incentive. Find another supplier, build another payment system, develop another technology, create another route. Sometimes those efforts fail, sometimes they succeed. When they succeed, the effectiveness of future sanctions declines. Not immediately, gradually, almost invisibly. Remember the idea from part 1 about tools changing once people learn to defend against them? This is where it lands. Russia's experience after 2022 accelerated discussions about non-dollar trade arrangements. China expanded efforts around financial infrastructure outside Western systems. Regional trading blocs explored settlement mechanisms that would have seemed niche a decade ago. Most remain small compared to the dollar system. That distinction is important. The dollar is not disappearing. Anyone predicting its imminent collapse is usually selling certainty where none exists. Yet dominance and erosion are different concepts. A system can remain dominant while becoming slightly less dominant every year. The trend matters more than the headline, and trends are often invisible until they suddenly aren't. The deeper issue isn't whether sanctions work. They do. The deeper issue is whether sanctions become less powerful when used repeatedly against countries large enough to adapt. That's a harder question. I'm not completely certain of the answer. Neither are most policymakers, despite occasional displays of confidence. The data is still arriving. History is still being written. What I am confident about is this. The competition between the United States and China is no longer primarily a military contest, nor is it purely a trade dispute. It's a contest between two different theories of power, one built around controlling critical systems, the other built around supplying critical goods. And the outcome may depend on something neither side fully controls. Whether the rest of the world decides it values access more than influence, or influence more than access. That decision is already being made, country by country, contract by contract, factory by factory, and the verdict is far from settled. There's a phrase that appears constantly in discussions about great powers: rules-based order. People usually treat it as a political concept. Increasingly, I think it's an industrial concept, because rules only matter when someone has the capacity to operate within them or outside them. A nation that produces critical goods gains bargaining power. A nation that controls critical systems gains bargaining power. The real contest is determining which form of bargaining power ages better. For much of the post-Cold War era, the answer seemed obvious. Control the financial plumbing, control advanced technology, control the institutions through which global commerce flows. Washington excelled at all three. That strategy delivered enormous advantages. Yet the world of 2026 looks different from the world of 1996. Supply chains have become strategic assets in a way many policymakers underestimated. Energy security has returned as a central concern. Governments increasingly worry about where things are made, not merely how cheaply they can be purchased. The language has changed. Efficiency used to be the objective. Resilience became the objective. Then resilience started competing with affordability. And suddenly countries discovered that every economic choice contains a trade-off. Manufacturing at home increases security, often at a higher cost. Importing from the most efficient producer lowers costs, sometimes at the expense of strategic flexibility. There is no magical solution that eliminates this tension, only different balances. That's why both Washington and Beijing are spending extraordinary sums trying to reshape economic geography. The United States isn't talking about reshoring because it dislikes trade. It's talking about reshoring because dependence feels dangerous. China isn't investing in technological self-sufficiency because it dislikes globalization. It's investing because dependence feels dangerous there too. Each side is responding to the same lesson. Reliance becomes a vulnerability once politics enters the equation. What's fascinating is how similar their conclusions are, despite their rivalry. The methods differ. The diagnosis increasingly does not. Let's return to the opening observation. China produces around 80% of the world's solar panels. America produces a remarkable share of the world's sanctions. The line works because it sounds like a contrast, but it misses something important. Neither country wants to be defined solely by that role. China does not want to be merely the factory. The United States does not want to be merely the regulator. Beijing is pushing aggressively into advanced technologies, aerospace, artificial intelligence, semiconductor development, and high-end manufacturing. Washington is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into industrial revival through legislation, subsidies, and strategic investment. Both are moving toward the center, not away from it. And that's the development many observers still underestimate. The future probably doesn't belong exclusively to manufacturing power, nor exclusively to financial power. It belongs to whoever combines the largest number of reinforcing advantages at the same time: production, technology, finance, energy, talent, infrastructure. The country that assembles the strongest combination wins more often than the country that dominates a single category. That's why simplistic scorecards keep failing. A factory count doesn't tell the whole story. Neither does a sanctions list. The world economy is becoming less specialized and more strategic. Countries want backup suppliers, backup technologies, backup payment systems, backup energy sources. Redundancy, once considered inefficient, is increasingly viewed as insurance. And insurance always looks expensive until the day it's needed. My own view is relatively straightforward. I think manufacturing capacity is becoming more valuable than many Western policymakers believed 20 years ago. Not because factories alone determine power, because factories generate options. Options during crises, options during shortages, options during political disputes, options during wars. History tends to reward countries that possess options. At the same time, I think predictions of American decline remain premature. The United States still occupies commanding positions in finance, software, research, defense technology, and capital allocation. Those are not small advantages. They are enormous ones. The more interesting question isn't whether America declines or China rises. The more interesting question is whether both countries eventually converge toward the same realization. That durable power requires both production and control, both factories and finance, both engineers and institutions. If that happens, the rivalry of the next decade may look less like a contest over ideology and more like a contest over capacity. Who can build? Who can innovate? Who can adapt? Who can absorb shocks without breaking? That's a harder competition than most headlines suggest, and it's probably the one that matters. As for a prediction, I'll give you a specific one. Over the next 10 years, the most important geopolitical metric won't be aircraft carriers, GDP rankings, or even military spending. It will be the ability to produce critical technologies at scale while maintaining access to global markets. Countries that achieve both will gain influence. Countries that achieve only one will spend years explaining why influence didn't arrive. One final thought. Factories create dependence. Sanctions create resistance. The first grows through demand. The second grows through use. Eventually, every great power discovers that producing something people need is often easier than convincing them to obey. And history has a habit of keeping score in shipments, not press releases. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe for the next one. There's a lot happening beneath the headlines, and that's usually where the interesting story lives.